Hi, this is Dr. Cynthia Elise Smith, and the doctor is in. Hi, everybody, anybody. um, this lecture is called Unity of Purpose versus Unity of Identity, of Missed Opportunities and the Hope for New Ones. As always, my name is Dr. Cynthia Elise Smith, and I am an anti racism, anti white supremacism essayist and educator, specializing in presentations and essays and lectures with alternative views on race, racist color, racist character, and white supremacy. I offer deeper, more critical perspectives on these subjects, including the potential implications of racialized wording in the U.S. language lexicon that may not be ordinarily considered. Now, as I say in all my essays and all my uh, videos, I'm not here to change anybody's mind, but I want to offer you a critical perspective that will hopefully allow you to change your own mind. Before I begin, though, I want to point out the three tools that I use and that I'd like you to use when listening to this lecture. And they are called the three C's of navigating through the language system of racism and white supremacy. Before I go any further, I want to make sure that if there's anybody here, you can hear me. Hi, Regina. How are you? I don't know whether Rock is still here, but I think he was here before I even went live. I don't know how that could happen, but it did. But I saw him here. Um, can you hear me, Regina? If you can, put a one in the chat if you can hear me, because I can see the chat. Oh, good. Okay, good. Okay. So, Rock, you saw me while I was preparing, huh? Anyway, hi, Ronald. Okay, I'm glad. I'm glad. Now you can. I'd like you to share this video with people that you think might be interested in this lecture, and and of course after the lecture you can come up in the panel mode and discuss it with me, or ask questions. Um, I would just ask that you put a question mark, one of those emoji question marks in there, so that I'll know that it's a question. Okay. All right. Now, as I do the lecture, I'm not going to be um, looking at the comments, but after the lecture, I will refer to the comments. Now, getting back to the things that are of utmost importance, the three C's of navigating through the language system of racism and white supremacy, the first thing is comprehension. Now, comprehension is very important because it's the essence of understanding. In fact, it is the synonym for understanding what you're saying, hearing, being told, writing, or reading, or the ability of one's mind to form and craft the imagery and concepts from words. Okay. The second one, and as equally as important, is context. Context is important because context uh, is the ability to understand the circumstances that form the setting for an event, uh, a statement, or an idea, and in terms through which it can be fully understood and assessed. So often, things are taken out of context. And when things are taken out of context, then understanding or comprehension is impossible. Okay? Third and last but not least is connotation. Connotation is so important because connotation is the feeling of the words. It is um, the part that invokes that feeling in addition to the literal or primary meaning of the word. The connotation uh, is the feeling because it is the expressive part of the words. For example, it's the part of the word or sentence or paragraph that forms the thought. I mean, from the thought, which create the drama. It's how you feel. It's the difference between someone saying, for example, um, "I love you" and "I hate you." You can say them with the same with the same inflection, but they will have different connotations. Okay, different feelings. So those are the three: comprehension, context, and connotation. Those are the three tools that are very, very important when you are listening to me, listening to my lectures, and I would dare say in everyday life while navigating through this um, racist set of paradoxes that we live in this country. Okay? All right, so I'm going to begin reading. The title is called Unity of Purpose versus Unity of Identity. Oh, before I begin to read, I want to put you into a particular frame of mind as it relates to how Black people think of ourselves in terms of unity, because we're going to be talking about unity here, but it's a different context. But I thought I did have something like this. There is this video by itself on YouTube, but again, not that many people watch my YouTube channel. So um, I want to hold on a second. So I want to play this for you first to put you in gear in terms of our unity. All right. Let's start it over. I want to start it all the way over. Okay. The dream for Black unity is a fallacy of white supremacy, which suggests to the mind of Black people that unity is gone, never was, once was, or is elusive. So we dream for something we want because we believe us. As long as we are for it, we will not realize we already have it. We are under the impression that numbers or a majority is what unity means. That is not coincidental. This country created a structure that says majority rules, but this too is a fallacy. Indeed, white people are not the majority in the world, and white men are not the majority in the U.S. Consider then, if the majority is in fact not ruling, why would Black people believe that it takes one? Indoctrination and conditioning of the kind that says unity equals numbers, and we need to wait for those numbers before we have any chance for power. Unity is a concept, not a weapon. Blackness is a collective state of being, which is who we are. And this is what the concept of unity is. This is what will never be broken as long as we recognize it and understand we will never have to wait for it. Okay. Alrighty. Again, that is actually on my YouTube channel. It's called Unity for anybody who wants to see it again. I thought that that was appropriate to put that here because um, I've been feeling kind of sad of late, and it has to do with the fact that many of the content creators that I have come to know and with whom I've become a bit attached are fighting among themselves, and it 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 breaks my heart. It really does, and that's, I guess, because I'm not. While I'm very familiar with YouTube, I wasn't familiar with the beef sector and all that entails. And when I became associated with or uh, certain people's personas on YouTube and began to really participate in a lot of the things that they offered, I didn't realize that a number of them do not like each other, and that makes me sad. So um, I just thought I'd put that little thing about unity on there, and I hope that at some point um, the bickering and the backbiting will transform into something more positive for the people that I've come to really care about and I appreciate. And I do appreciate them all. And I simply refuse to take up sides. Okay? That's not going to happen ever. Okay? Anyway, let's get back to the lecture. The lecture is called Unity of Purpose versus Unity of Identity, of Missed Opportunities and the Hope for New Ones. The United States has a penchant for corralling people into stables of identity. Hold on one second. Let me get comfortable before I actually begin this essay, because sometimes sometimes the microphone goes out because I might lean back or something. Okay. The United States has a penchant for corralling people into stables of identity for their own supremacist segregationist purposes, all the while enticing each group to believe self segregating spaces are best for unity and identity. Did you hear that? I'm going to repeat it. The United States has a penchant for corralling people into stables of identity for their own supremacist segregationist purposes, all the while enticing each group to believe self segregating spaces are best for unity and identity. White people come from every conceivable place on earth where the credentials consist of ancestral and current European geographical lineage, little to no melanin in skin pigment, and assignment of the color white by a government of wealthy white elites, as noted in the census for Egyptians and some other northern Africans and Middle Eastern countries. Everyone should understand by now that the Africans who arrived in chains to the American shore were from a number of Western African countries with different ethnicities, varied languages, and cultures, all brought together into one corral called Negroes and Black. Even the indigenous peoples of America, Hispanics, Latinas, and Latinos, are a wide ranging set of different ethnicities and geographical heritages. In the case of people in America who identify as Asians, whether they were from India, China, Indonesia, the Philippines, Japan, Thailand, or any number of Pacific Island nations and principalities, these people are not monolithic in any of their respective nationalism, ethnicities, cultures, and ideologies. But they were cast as Orientals and then Asians. Moreover, for these people with ancestral and geographical lineage from the far east side of the globe and who have lived in the United States since its inception, there is one fact that they can count on, like other ethnicities, nationalities, genders, sexes, and linguistically marginalized groups. They all have experienced some form of the same discrimination, denial, and brutality as Black people here in this country, albeit in some cases not to the same extent as the continued aggression toward Black people by white people. Asian people, however, have a uniquely interesting history with Black America and throughout some of the same periods in history, with the exception of the enslavement itself. In fact, there was a direct parallel during the civil rights movement for Black people and when a similar civil rights movement for Asian people began. How many of you know that there was a simultaneous um, civil rights movement going on in the Asian community in the 60s with the Black Power, Black Civil Rights movement during the 60s? After the Vietnam War, many radical Asian American groups dissolved. Hold on a second. Let me make sure. I almost, mm, talk about being prepared, right? Okay. Dubbed Yellow Power during this period of the 60s and the 70s, Asian activists fought for inclusion. Okay. It was called Yellow Power during the period of the 60s and 70s, where Asian activists fought for inclusion through ethnic studies in higher education, for ending the Vietnam War, and for reparations for Japanese people held against their will in internment camps during World War II. According to journalist Nadra Karim Nittel, writing for Thought.co, Asians identified with the plight of Black people and their struggle to expose institutional racism and government hypocrisy. You know, another over in Europe, the Northern Irish, also took their cues from the civil rights movement of Black people in their struggle for rights, for religious rights, um, with England, with Britain, the Catholics versus the Protestants. Realizing they too were being discriminated against, Nittle explained, Black activism played a fundamental role in the launch of the Asian civil rights movement. And that little bit comes from, hold on a second, that comes from the history of the Asian American civil rights movement, written in March 14th, 2021 on thought.co. Over time, however, and this is important, over time, Once the demands for inclusion were met and the war ended, now you have to hear this. Over time, however, once their demands for inclusion were met and the war ended, Asian assimilation and integration into the United States and its American culture brought with it a measure of wealth and success, both economically and socially, for many. And during the period of the post racial colorblind era, none of the various ethnicities within their huge umbrella were saddled with the after effects of backlash Black people received from the Black civil rights movement. They actually received what they fought for. Niddle wrote, after the Vietnam War, many Asian American groups dissolved. There was no unifying cause to rally around. For Japanese Americans, though, the experience of being interned had left festering wounds. Activists organized to have the federal government apologize for its actions during World War II. In 1976, President Gerald Ford signed Proclamation 4417, in which internment was declared a national mistake. In 1976. Does anybody remember anything happening in the Black community where there was there any proclamation made that the enslavement was a national mistake? Nope. Now I want to make this clear though. This is not being done to in any way to bash or cast a negative light on the Asian people. This is a study on civil rights movements and how they could very well have worked together as opposed to being considered separate and apart. Okay, especially in light of the fact that many Asian American people here today include themselves among the people of color identifying moniker. So in 1976, President Gerald Ford signed Proclamation 4417, in which internment was declared a national mistake. A dozen years later, President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, which distributed, now listen, which distributed $20,000 in reparations to surviving internees and or their heirs. Money. The government gave them money. $20,000 to surviving internees or their heirs and included an apology from the federal government. During the same period, there were no reparations for the enslavement, Jim Crow, the system of racism as it existed during the entire 20th century, state-sanctioned violence against Black people or lynchings. Moreover, there is still no national anti-lynching law or other respite for Black people who struggled during the same period of the 60s and the 70s. There has still been no national apology for either the enslavement of millions or the atrocities that were a consequence of the overthrow of Reconstruction. Racism as a system of denial and discrimination was only expanded to include limited apportionment of opportunity in the areas of education, housing, and employment, although barriers in those areas remained overall. During the post racial colorblind era of the late 60s through the end of the 20th century and throughout the beginning of the 21st century, Asians did not appear to complain of discrimination except where it related to affirmative action in higher education. It also appeared that lawsuits being brought up over affirmative action were efforts being used to assist the right wing conservative elements who had been chiseling away at the only reparative relief granted for Black people for the generations of discrimination in education and employment. I mean, affirmative action was the only reparative relief granted us during that period of time, and all that was um, a promise by companies who were getting money from the government, because private small companies could still discriminate, basically, whether you know that or not. Only people who had only companies with, I think, 50 or more employees, something like that, and who got government funding from the U.S. government were bound by the Civil Rights Act. But anyway, so they had been chiseling away at the only reparative relief granted for Black people for the generations of discrimination in education and employment. It also appeared as if their efforts would destroy the last best hope for affirmative action. If there were causes to rail against or celebrate, they were largely ignored by the media and the government, and Asians remained the group least likely to complain. One among many other stereotypes that ensued. Smarter, more well adjusted families, genius children who excelled in math and the sciences, mild, timid, exotic, or over sexualized and subservience driven women, and people generally prone to acquiescence. They were the good minority, as that term minority is still used to denote value subliminally in white supremacist in white supremacy as inferiority, rather than simply using the numerical value. And we talked about that on the last lecture that I gave that bombed out a couple times. But anyway, I hope this is resonating with you. This is a discussion of, you know, the the parallel groups, uh, civil rights, civil rights pushes towards civil rights, and how rather than it being a um, group effort by both the Asian population and Black people. And that's not to say that there weren't some, but not generally. Okay. And how, as long as they kept themselves separate from our struggle, they got what they wanted, they got what they needed. And it wasn't, I don't say that that they're wrong necessarily. It's just, if you look at the title, it was a missed opportunity, because when you understand that they took their cues from our struggle, it would have been nice if they had struggled with us as opposed to separate from us. So the Asians were touted as better than the black minority, a major step up. It appeared to many that Asians were even superior to white people educationally, becoming the very epitome of meritocracy and achievement aspirations or fears of failure for both white and black people. You know how those stereotypes, and those stereotypes persist today, that they're the smartest. But this essay is not meant to be a historical overview of the specific plight or advantages of Asian people in the United States. History is already replete with plenty to research. Okay, keep that in mind. This is not a historical overview of the specific plight or advantages of Asian people. Okay, this essay is intended to be a discussion of identity, of unity, versus purpose driven unity, missed opportunities, and a way forward. Of tremendous importance is the context from which I'm drawing the connotations conveyed for comprehension, is those words, of the essay's objective. It is important to draw upon the contextual framework of identity unity versus purpose driven unity. Okay? Identity unity versus purpose driven unity. No two group had more reasons to coalesce around the atrocities brought on by white supremacy than Asians and black people during the 60s and the 70s, since both groups were experiencing degrees of discrimination. Now, both groups are experiencing violence and terror, and there is a dramatic difference this time because the 21st century iteration of racism, as it is described today, is skewed in how it defines racism from the way it was defined during the movements of the 60s and the 70s. Back then, the issue had turned from equality, equity, opportunity, and justice for the formerly enslaved and their descendants to desegregation of white spaces, which was easily broadened to include other races similarly situated. In addition, as a result of the broad abstraction given to the definition of racism today and the term itself when used to describe individuals of all races and ethnicities, the ever rearticulating ideology of whiteness and its associated supremacist view of behavior among its own people has convoluted what even constitutes racism or racists, creating racists of the very people still being perpetually victimized by racism. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that old thing about black people being racist, which is absurd. While both black and Asian people experience violence and terror from white supremacists, crimes against Asian people stemming from the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic is directly a consequence of behavior born out of the ideology of white supremacy, and that term is not being used loosely but deliberately throughout this essay, and is why there is an extremely important idea that must be stressed in confronting the concept of unity of purpose and of identity. It cannot be stressed enough how much people need to understand racialized terminology and how it is used within the lexicon of white supremacist ideology. Words and their use can unite and divide. Connotation. Okay? Words and their use can unite and divide. We see that, I mean, just on just as an aside, we see that today in these YouTube streets among people who fight each other with words online and divide each other and others based on those words that they use. Therefore, it is important to completely comprehend what is actually being said, read, or written in order to unite under a purpose driven reality. A purpose driven reality rather than the rhetoric of identity. It is at this junction the term white supremacy must be used where it applies and not substituted for the term racism. Okay? And I do that often. White supremacy is white supremacy, and racism is racism. They are not the same thing. One is the ideology, and one is the system that was designed to maintain it in perpetuity. Okay? The system of racism, okay, it says, the reason cannot be stressed more emphatically. And that is that the term white supremacy is used where it is applied and not substituted for the term racism. Okay? The system of racism sustains the ideology of white supremacy. Do you understand that? The system of racism sustains and maintains the ideology of white supremacy. And although one could not exist without the other, one indeed existed first, before the other. And it existed as a belief rooted in superiority, exclusivity, and supreme sovereignty over the planet, and I dare say the universe, and certainly the New World, before racism as a structural system for denial and discrimination existed. So, in a nutshell, you needed to have white supremacy before you had racism, because racism was designed and created to sustain structured, institutionalized through laws, covenants, so forth, etc., to sustain the ideology that existed before racism. This is extremely important to understand because it is the one term that is always treated as an afterthought in conjunction with racism, as though racism is primary if referenced, spoken, written, or read, and not actively explored. The fact of the matter is, white supremacy existed among the wealthy elite who needed a way to control and subjugate the enslaved people with dark pigments, as well as those poor masses from Europe who shared theirs. After Bacon's Rebellion, and I think a lot of you may have heard about Bacon's Rebellion, it's very often referred to. After Bacon's rebellion frightened these wealthy elites with the prospect of the poor, indentured, and enslaved from the lower class uniting with a common purpose of overthrowing them, they found convenience and expediency in the two colors, black and white, which were already fixed as light and dark, good and evil, and associated them as a merit metric. Okay? As a merit metric for superiority and inferiority, assigning them to the bodies of the people they would continue to control to this day. Therefore, the questions become, what is the overarching similarity that has remained for both Asian people and Black people, and what has not been the case for either since the dawn of the post-racial colorblind era? During the 60s and the 70s, both Black and Asian people unified under their own unique banners of shared identity. They were no colored Asians. Let me repeat that. During the 60s and the 70s, Black and Asian people unified under their own unique banners of shared identity. There were no colored Asians. Just like, and that was because colored was exclusive to the Black person in America. They were not considered the colored people by Black people or white people, nor did they identify with the term colored. That was exclusively for the Negroes. Asian people didn't have to identify with Black people as colored during that time. They were not people of color during that time. No part of the 20th century saw any other ethnic or geographic group that was non-white as colored except for Black people. Let's make that extremely clear. Asian people did not have to identify with Black people as colored during that time. They were identifying as yellow. Besides, racism was understood as a what? Class? As a Negro problem. As a Negro system. A Black thing. It wasn't until the Civil Rights Act was passed that more identities began to move into the growing marginalized corral of the so-called protected classes. Today, however, it is interesting to note more and more Asians are identifying with the term people of color and the acronym POC, along with their own AAPI acronym, in their most recent struggle against the specter of violence and actual violence they have suffered. And that is part of the enigmatic dichotomy of using the terms racism and racist today to describe what they are experiencing. In identifying as people of color, They are representing themselves in an even larger corral of diversity in the 21st century iteration of how racism now expresses itself. In answering the previous questions, the overarching similarity has been terror and violence brought on by white supremacists with all of their insidious behavior and all of the damage they cause. However, what has not been the case for Asian people since their simultaneous movements with Black people in the 60s and 70s is racism. Let me repeat that. In answering the previous questions, the overarching similarity has been terror and violence brought on by white supremacists with all their insidious behavior and all of the damage they cause. However, what has not been the case for Asian people since their simultaneous movements with Black people in the 60s and 70s is racism. For Asians to be experiencing racism today, as the term was originally created and how it originally operated, I want you to pay attention here. There would have to be a denial of equity, equality, opportunity, and justice exacted on them as newly freed enslaved or their Asian descendants in perpetuity in order to sustain the ideology of whiteness as superior. Of course, this is ludicrous since Asians were not part of the enslaved. It is also disingenuous as a term since discrimination and lack of inclusion is not at issue for them today as it was during the 60s and the 70s. Racism is the term for that system which ensures the playing field will remain inequitable and unequal, sustaining the fallacy of whiteness and superiority ascribed to the color white and inferiority of anyone relegated to the color Black, and the theory that skin pigment or the assignment of the color white to imply skin color granted the individual with certain natural rights and privileges not afforded to their Black counterparts. This is simply not the case for Asian people on any day. Whether or not one subscribes to the original reason for the creation of systemic racism or its subsequent variations and iterations today, this much is clear. Identity discrimination is not their issue. State sanctioned violence is not their issue. Injustice is not their issue. Inequity and inequality is not their issue. These issues are not being addressed in their most recent struggle. And that is the primary difference between the parallel movements of the 60s and the 70s and today. Are you getting it? Are you understanding? White supremacist violence, terror, and murder is their issue. White supremacists, not racist, but white supremacist. Okay? Remember what I said before about them being similar. but one came before the other. Racism was designed and created for Black newly freed and their descendants to inherit in perpetuity. Okay? That's what the system of racism was designed for. Now, I don't care whether they open that umbrella up and add more people and try to create a larger corral, but that was what it was. Okay? What the Asians engulfed in the aftermath of the six who were murdered are experiencing is a resurgence of violence brought on by bigotry and hatred of ethnicities and ancestral nationalities, which is xenophobia. While there are those who do try to conflate xenophobia with racism, especially those who believe racism is the cause of individual behavior, attempting to conflate xenophobia with the system of racism is ambiguous and a fallacy simply because the system also includes the use of tools for the behavior born out of the ideology of white supremacy. All that being said, one of the major problems for so many years may be a lack of awareness of the historical parallels in the lives of both groups and of the almost simultaneous movements of both. It cannot be stated enough just how close Asian and Black people might have come to being a blended force against white supremacy. Instead, relations between the Asian and Black people have suffered over the years, and it cannot be discounted. One of the reasons is probably just how close their movements were during the 20th century. Although many Black activists looked to some of the literature of Chairman Mao Zedong, and a member of the Black Panther Party was a Japanese American named Richard Aoki, who donated weapons and trained the Panthers in the use of the weapons he donated back then. The two movements were not intersectional, and there was no joining or coalescing of the two. In addition, due to the white supremacist practice of encouraging animosity against Black people over the generations, it also appeared some Asian people living here who had immigrated seemingly bought into the white American narrative stereotype of the criminal and the thug. The culmination of their entrance into Black communities with many businesses that did not enrich those communities, the animosity of some of them projected, and individual biased behavior continues to make it extremely difficult to find solidarity and camaraderie. It is fascinating to imagine what might have happened in this nation if both groups of people disregarded their individual identities and unified under one banner of ending white supremacy and systemic racism, rather than one group taking a page from the playbook of the other and going separate ways. Unlike Bacon's rebellion, when the groups came together out of a purposefully driven camaraderie to overthrow the barbaric wealthy gentry, the question of whether the outcome of the Black and yellow civil rights movements might have been more successful for everyone had they come together back then, but it will never be answered. Still, this 21st century has caused a reckoning with the likes no one has seen since the time during the 60s and the 70s. And perhaps this is the opportunity neither should let pass this time. Perhaps the key to true solidarity and unity is not in the identity of the participants, but in the purpose for uniting, like Bacon's Rebellion, but of course without the violence associated with it. Perhaps if both understood what was really driving the behavior and the violence, there could truly be a unity of purpose. Perhaps if both understood how the terminology and the language of white supremacy affects everyone, and how the ideology has destroyed many, there could also be a unity of purpose. It is also clear that all affected groups will finally have to rally behind Black people who are still undeniably the vanguard or the front line of the fight for equality, equity, opportunity, and justice. Until then, there will always be a sort of jockeying for position in the identity war behind who is racist and who is affected the most, instead of the real purpose driven battle to end what is detrimental to us all, the battle to end white supremacy. Now, that concludes the portion of the lecture where I just spout off and read. And let me look at these. Okay. I don't know whether people are still here. If you are, if you're here, hi, hi Tigran, D Jones, Ronald Steffens, Rock, Nation, and Regina. I don't know whether you guys are still here. I hope you are. If you'd like, you can put a question in if you want to discuss this. Basically, what this lecture was about was how during the 60s and the 70s, we were given a unique opportunity where we could have come together and work to dismantle an entire ideology of superiority of white people, of whiteness rather, and instead Asians got a little money and were allowed to assimilate, and for all intents and purposes, since they were the quote good minority, they got to um, be considered honorary white people, and Black people got limited apportionment of opportunity in the areas of employment and education and housing. That was it. No justice. If we had received justice, there would be no state sanctioned violence. There would have been laws put on the books for anti lynching. Um, Police would not be used in the way that they are used today, which is the same as they were used during enslavement, basically. Uh, Things might be a little different because we would have come together, but it didn't happen. And that's that. So I'm going to drop the link to see if anybody would like to come up and talk about this. If anybody's here, you can feel free to talk about it. There it is. Please feel free to hit the link if you want to. You don't have to think, you don't have to feel like what um, you don't have to feel like you can't talk about it with me. There is no question that is too simple. Um, all questions are honored. If you don't understand something, say it. Say I don't get this part. You know what I mean? Tell me what you get. Tell me what you don't get, or talk about it in general. Just stay within the context of what this was supposed to be, and which is the fact that we had an we both of us, both groups had an opportunity to get rid of something that was even more important than uh, eradicating systemic racism. Because once you get rid of the ideology that set forth the system that created the system, then you don't have any need for that system anymore. Once there's true equality, there's no need for that system anymore. So you can feel free to, ah, how about that? So you can definitely come up if you want. If you don't want to, that's okay. If you have any questions, just put an emoji question mark in there so I can see it as a question. Oh, I see my light bulbs. Yes. Yes. How about if you're still here? How about let's throw in some light bulbs? Light bulbs are our emoji because we are, my intent is to have us light up the world with knowledge of how to navigate these murky waters because it don't look like it's going anywhere, gang. My grandchildren are experiencing it now, are living in racialized spaces with racist people and white supremacist people. Um, I know that it will not go away before I'm gone. I mean, if I'm fortunate, I'll have what, another 20 years maybe on this earth. If I'm very fortunate, a good friend of mine lived until um, his mother lived until 105 before she passed. Yeah, but I don't know. I don't hold out that kind of hope. I was told some years ago, I was given a fortune that I think is going to hold true because of one of the other things that she said. She said that I was going to have problems with my knees. She said, watch your knees. That came true. And she said I was going to live well into my 80s. I don't think I'm gonna live no more longer than that. My kids would beg to differ, but I've lived. I am living an okay life. I mean, it's okay if I live well into my 80s. I'll be happy. I'll be thankful because that will mean that I lived long enough to see my last two baby grandchildren become adults, and that's what I'm looking forward to. I want to see them become adults. But anyway, since there doesn't appear to be any, I think there's really like only two people, two live viewers. Yeah, it says Eddie Davis. Okay. I think there is Tanya Reynolds. Oh, hey. Hey, Tanya. And Kawika Mustafa. I hope I pronounced it okay. I don't know whether you're still here, but oh, okay. You said you stepped out, but you just got back. Okay. Um, I see our light bulbs. Again, I did put the link down there, but I don't think anybody is even there to say anything or to get into the chat. So I'm gonna get ready to go. This will be put. This will be in the live section of my YouTube channel, and you can always go back and look at it and comment, share, like, put some likes in the video. I'm not sure how many likes there are. Hopefully, there'll be some likes later. Anyway, I'm gonna go, and I'll talk to you guys later. Now, before I go, the next essay that I'm going to do for you guys is going to be called Rationalizations, a discussion about the red S on a black chest. I hope that you find that interesting. I hope that you found this interesting. It's a little bit of history for you, and I hope you find it interesting. Hope you found it interesting, and I'll talk to you guys later. So for now, the doctor is out.